The clock on the steeple of Ellsworth, Kansas's modest church, struck noon as Florence Whittaker stared at the letter in her trembling hands. Her husband's grave, not yet 6 months cold when her brother-in-law made his intentions devastatingly clear. She would marry him by month's end or face ruin and homelessness with her young son. Florence folded the letter carefully along its creases, tucking it into the pocket of her skirt as she gazed out the window of the small mercantile store she had managed to keep running since Thomas's death from typhoid fever last winter. The business barely kept them fed, but it was hers at least for now. According to Jeremiah Whittaker, her late husband's older brother, the property and store belonged to the Whittaker family, not to her. Without a husband bearing the family name, she would be forced out. "Might I get some coffee beans, Mrs. Whittaker?" The voice from the doorway pulled Florence from her thoughts. "Of course, Mr. Davenport," she said, mustering a smile as she moved behind the counter. The elderly man was a regular, one of the few townsfolk who continued patronizing her store, even after whispers began circulating that a woman had no business running an establishment on her own. As she measured coffee beans into a paper sack, Florence caught sight of her reflection in the small mirror behind the counter. At 26, she still possessed the auburn hair and clear blue eyes that had once caught Thomas's attention, though worry had etched fine lines around her mouth. She'd been only 20 when they married, 24 when she gave birth to their son James, and now a widow before her time. "Been hearing talk around town," Mr. Davenport said hesitantly as he handed over his coins. "About Jeremiah coming to call on you." Florence's hand stilled. "News travels fast in Ellsworth. It's 1877, Mrs. Whittaker. World's changing, but some men still think a woman's only purpose is to be someone's wife." The old man shook his head. "Doesn't seem right, forcing your hand like that." "No, it doesn't," Florence agreed softly. "But what choice do I have? James and I need a roof over our heads." Mr. Davenport looked like he wanted to say more but merely nodded and took his parcel. "Good day to you, madam." After he left, Florence locked the door and flipped the sign to closed for her midday break. She needed to check on James, who was being watched by Mrs. Holloway next door while Florence tended the store. The bright Kansas sun beat down mercilessly as she crossed the dusty street. Ellsworth had grown considerably in the past few years, transforming from a remote outpost to a thriving cattle town. The railroad had brought prosperity, but also a rougher element: cowboys, gamblers, and drifters looking for opportunity or escape. Mrs. Holloway's plump, cheerful face appeared at the door before Florence could knock. "He's napping like an angel," she whispered. "Come in and have some tea. You look like you could use it." Florence followed her neighbor into the small but tidy home, gratefully accepting the cup of tea pushed into her hands. "Jeremiah's coming tomorrow," Florence confessed, staring into the amber liquid. "He sent word ahead." Mrs. Holloway's face darkened. "That man has no shame." "Your Thomas not even cold in the ground. He says it's practical. The store needs a man's guidance and James needs a father." "What James needs is his mother happy," Mrs. Holloway retorted. "And everyone knows Jeremiah has been eyeing that store since Thomas first opened it." Florence sighed. "I've tried to think of alternatives, but without family to turn to." "Where would we go?" "You could sell the store," Mrs. Holloway suggested. "Take the money and start fresh somewhere else." "The store isn't mine to sell, according to Jeremiah. Thomas never properly transferred the deed." Florence's voice caught. In his illness, there wasn't time to settle such matters. "That scoundrel," Mrs. Holloway muttered, "using legal tricks to trap you." A soft cry from the other room signaled James was awake. Florence rose to retrieve her son, lifting the sleepy 2-year-old with Thomas's brown eyes and her auburn curls. "I should get back to the store," Florence said, cuddling James against her shoulder. "The afternoon stage brings the mail. Think on what I said, Mrs. Holloway urged, patting Florence's arm. There must be another way. But as Florence walked back to the store with James on her hip, she couldn't imagine what that other way might be. In 1877, a widow with a child and no family had precious few options, especially in a frontier town like Ellsworth. The afternoon passed in a blur of customers and restocking shelves. Florence had just begun tallying the day's receipts when the bell above the door jangled. She looked up, expecting to see a last-minute customer, but instead found Sheriff Miller's imposing figure filling the doorway. "Evening, Florence," he said, removing his hat. The silver at his temples caught the late afternoon sun. "Sheriff," she nodded. "What can I do for you? Wanted to check on you, given Jeremiah's coming to town tomorrow." The sheriff's bushy eyebrows drew together. "Word is he's pressing you to marry him." Florence's shoulders slumped. "Does everyone know my business?" "It's Ellsworth," Sheriff Miller said with a wry smile. "But in this case, Jeremiah himself has been boasting about it in letters to some of the town council members. Says he'll be setting things right at Whittaker Mercantile." A flash of anger momentarily overwhelmed Florence's despair. "Is that so? I just wanted you to know. If you need help." "Thank you, Sheriff, but what can anyone do? Without that deed in my name, I'm at Jeremiah's mercy." The sheriff nodded grimly. "Law's on his side, I'm afraid. But if he gets rough with you or the boy, Jeremiah isn't a violent man," Florence interrupted. "Just determined to have his way." After the sheriff left, Florence closed the store and took James upstairs to their small apartment above the mercantile. As she prepared a simple supper, her mind raced with possible solutions, each seeming as impossible as the last. She could refuse Jeremiah outright, but then where would they live? How would she support James? That night, after tucking James into his small bed, Florence sat by the window overlooking Ellsworth's Main Street. Saloon music drifted up from the Golden Palace down the block, while cowboys fresh from a cattle drive whooped and hollered. The spring cattle season was just beginning, bringing both commerce and chaos to their town. Her gaze drifted to a lone rider moving slowly down the street, his tall figure straight in the saddle despite the late hour. Something about his unhurried pace and broad shoulders made her watch him longer than she normally would. He stopped his horse in front of the hotel across the street, dismounting with a fluid grace that spoke of a lifetime in the saddle. As he turned toward the hotel entrance, the light from the lobby briefly illuminated his face strong-jawed, weathered by sun and wind, with eyes that seemed to be scanning everything at once. A cowboy, but not the rowdy sort that usually passed through Ellsworth. This man moved with purpose and awareness. Florence drew back from the window, suddenly self-conscious about watching a stranger, and turned her attention to preparing for Jeremiah's arrival the next day. Morning came too quickly. Florence dressed with care, choosing her second-best dress navy blue cotton with white trim. She wouldn't give Jeremiah the satisfaction of thinking she'd dressed up for him, but neither did she want to appear as though she'd given up. After breakfast, she left James with Mrs. Holloway again and opened the store precisely at 8 o'clock. The morning dragged, each tick of the clock bringing Jeremiah's arrival closer. By noon, Florence's nerves were frayed to breaking. The bell above the door rang, and Florence steeled herself, expecting to see her brother-in-law's self-satisfied face. Instead, the cowboy from the previous night stood in the doorway, his tall frame nearly touching the top of the frame. "Madam," he said, removing his hat to reveal dark hair in need of a trim. "Need some supplies if you're open." "Of course," Florence replied, relief washing over her at the temporary reprieve. "What can I help you with?" "Coffee, flour, beans," he listed, his voice a pleasant baritone with the hint of a drawl. "Some tobacco, if you've got it." As Florence gathered his supplies, she noticed his eyes a startling green that contrasted with his sun-darkened skin, taking in every detail of the store. Not in a way that made her uncomfortable, but with the attention of someone who missed nothing. "Passing through?" she asked politely, wrapping the coffee in paper. "For now," he answered. "Name's Nathan Aldridge. Just finished a drive up from Texas." "Florence Whittaker," she replied. "This is my store." A small smile touched his lips. "Figured as much. Sign outside says Whittaker Mercantile." Florence felt her cheeks warm. "Yes, well, it was my husband's. He passed last winter." Nathan Aldridge's expression sobered immediately. "My condolences, Mrs. Whittaker." "Thank you," she said, continuing to gather his supplies. "Will you be staying in Ellsworth long, Mr. Aldridge?" "Depends," he said cryptically. "Got some business to attend to." The bell jangled again, and this time Jeremiah Whittaker strode in, his expensive boots gleaming and his suit unwrinkled despite his journey from Topeka. His eyes narrowed at the sight of Nathan. "Florence," he said without preamble, "I see you're busy with a customer. I'll wait." "Jeremiah," she acknowledged, her stomach nodding. "This is Mr. Aldridge. Mr. Aldridge, my brother-in-law, Jeremiah Whittaker." Nathan nodded politely but said nothing as he paid for his supplies. Florence wrapped everything in a bundle and handed it to him. "Appreciate it, Mrs. Whittaker," he said, putting his hat back on. As he turned to go, his eyes met hers briefly, and Florence had the strangest sensation that he understood far more about the situation than a stranger should. Once Nathan had left, Jeremiah wasted no time. "You're looking well, Florence," he said, though his eyes conveyed no warmth. At 40, Jeremiah was 14 years her senior, with thinning hair and a perpetual expression of calculation. "Thank you for the letter," Florence said stiffly, "though I must say your proposition was unexpected." Jeremiah's lips curved in what might generously be called a smile. "Hardly unexpected. You must have known arrangements would need to be made. A woman alone can't run a business like this." "I've managed for 6 months," Florence pointed out. "And the books, how do they look?" Florence hesitated. The truth was, the store had been struggling without Thomas's business acumen. She had basic figuring skills, but the complexities of inventory, pricing, and credit often overwhelmed her. "As I thought," Jeremiah said, interpreting her silence correctly. "It's settled then. We'll marry next Sunday." "I've already spoken to Reverend Hayes." Florence's hands clenched at her sides. "You had no right to make such arrangements without my consent." "Florence," Jeremiah's voice took on the patronizing tone she'd come to despise, "let's be practical. You need a husband. James needs a father. The store needs proper management. I'm offering a solution that benefits everyone." "And what do you gain from this arrangement?" Florence asked pointedly. A flash of irritation crossed Jeremiah's face. "Family responsibility. My brother would have wanted me to look after you and the boy." "Thomas would have wanted me to be happy," Florence countered. "Happiness is a luxury, my dear. Security is what matters." Jeremiah glanced around the store. "I'll be back tomorrow to review the accounts. We have much to discuss before the wedding." Without waiting for her response, he strode out, leaving Florence trembling with a mixture of anger and helplessness. How dare he? Yet what alternative did she have? The afternoon passed in a fog. Florence served customers mechanically, her mind racing with possibilities, each seeming more desperate than the last. Could she sell everything she owned and flee with James? But where would they go? She had no family, no connections outside of Ellsworth. As closing time approached, the bell rang once more. Florence looked up to see Nathan Aldridge again, this time without his bundle of supplies. "Mr. Aldridge," she greeted him. "Did you forget something?" "No, madam," he said, his hat in his hands. "I came to ask if you'd join me for supper." Florence blinked in surprise. I couldn't possibly. I have my son to care for, and bring him along," Nathan suggested easily. "Hotel dining rooms quiet this time of evening." "Mr. Aldridge, while I appreciate the invitation, I hardly know you," Nathan nodded. "Fair enough. But I get the feeling you could use someone to talk to, someone without a stake in your future." Florence stared at him, wondering how this stranger had so quickly grasped her situation. "Why would you care about my troubles?" Something flickered in Nathan's green eyes, a shadow of old pain, perhaps. "Let's just say I recognize a predicament when I see one." Florence hesitated. Propriety dictated she refuse. A respectable widow didn't dine with strange cowboys, especially not with her marriage to another man already announced. Yet something about Nathan Aldridge's steady gaze made her trust him. "I'll need to collect my son," she said finally. Nathan's smile was warm. "I'll wait." 20 minutes later, Florence walked into the hotel dining room with James in her arms, feeling the curious stares of other diners. Nathan rose from a corner table and pulled out a chair for her. "This is James," Florence said as she settled her son on her lap. "Pleasure to meet you, young man," Nathan said solemnly, making James giggle. To Florence's surprise, he produced a small wooden horse from his pocket. "Made this while I was waiting. Not much, but might keep him entertained." James reached eagerly for the toy, his small fingers tracing the crude but recognizable shape. "You're good with children," Florence observed as the waiter brought them menus. Nathan shrugged. "Had younger siblings, 5 of them." They ordered a steak for Nathan, chicken for Florence, and a bowl of mashed potatoes for James. As they waited for their food, Florence found herself relaxing for the first time in days. "So," Nathan said after James was happily occupied with his potatoes, "your brother-in-law seems determined to marry you." Florence's appetite vanished. "You noticed?" "Hard not to. Man practically staked his claim right there in the store." Nathan's tone was conversational, but his eyes were sharp. "I take it you're not eager for the match. Jeremiah and I have never been close," Florence admitted. "And the idea of marrying my husband's brother feels wrong, but he owns the store. The deed was never transferred to me when Thomas died. If I refuse, James and I will have nothing." Nathan listened without interruption as Florence explained her predicament. When she finished, he sat back, his expression thoughtful. "Seems to me there should be legal recourse," he said finally. "Your husband meant for you to have the store, didn't he?" "Of course," Florence said. "But intentions don't hold up in court without documentation. The property was purchased with Whittaker family money before we married. Jeremiah has all the legal standing, and no one in town can help." "No lawyer willing to challenge him?" Florence shook her head. "Jeremiah has connections in Topeka. He's a successful businessman there. No local lawyer would risk opposing him, especially not on behalf of a widow with no money to pay for services." Nathan's jaw tightened. "So he's using his position to force you into marriage. That's the way of things for women without means," Florence said with resignation. "I've spent weeks looking for alternatives." "And the wedding's set for Sunday." At her nod, Nathan asked, "What will you do?" Florence looked down at James, now drowsing against her shoulder. "What can I do? Except for my son's sake." After dinner, Nathan insisted on walking Florence and James home, though their apartment above the Mercantile was only across the street. They paused at the side entrance that led to the upstairs living quarters. "Thank you for dinner, Mr. Aldridge," Florence said formally, suddenly aware of how improper the evening might appear to onlookers. "And for listening." Nathan, he corrected gently. And I'm not done listening yet. I'd like to call on you tomorrow if you'll allow it. Florence frowned in confusion. I don't understand. You know my situation. I know you're being cornered into a decision you don't want to make, Nathan said. Maybe there's another way. There isn't, Florence said wearily. But you're kind to care. Nathan studied her face for a long moment. I'm staying at the hotel. If you change your mind about talking further, send word. As Florence climbed the stairs to her apartment, James half asleep in her arms, she wondered about the mysterious cowboy who seemed so determined to involve himself in her troubles. His interest made little sense. What could he possibly gain by helping her? Yet there had been something in his eyes. Not pity, but understanding, as if he knew exactly what it meant to be trapped by circumstances beyond his control. The next morning dawned clear and warm, typical Kansas spring weather. Florence dressed James and herself, then headed downstairs to open the store. She had just unlocked the front door when she saw Nathan approaching from the hotel. "Morning, Mrs. Whittaker," he called, tipping his hat. "Mr. Aldridge," she acknowledged, her cheeks warming at the memory of their dinner. "You're an early riser." "Cowboy's habit," he replied with a smile. "Thought I might help you open up if you'd allow it." Florence hesitated. "That's very kind, but I promise I won't get in your way," he added. "Just thought you might appreciate an extra pair of hands with the little one to look after." James, who had been clinging to Florence's skirts, suddenly darted forward with a delighted horse. He'd recognized Nathan as the giver of his new favorite toy. Nathan knelt to the boy's level. "You like that horse, do you?" James nodded enthusiastically, then reached up his arms in the universal childhood signal to be lifted. To Florence's surprise, Nathan obliged without hesitation, settling the child easily on his hip. "Looks like I've been hired," Nathan said with a grin that transformed his weathered face. Florence found herself smiling back despite her reservations. "I suppose I could use some help with the heavy stock in the back. The flour barrels need rotating." For the next hour, Nathan proved remarkably useful, not only moving the heavy items Florence had been struggling with for months, but also helping restack shelves and organize inventory. James followed him adoringly, chattering in his toddler language as if Nathan could understand every word. "You're good at this," Florence commented as Nathan efficiently rearranged a display of canned goods. "Have you worked in a store before?" "My family had a general store in Missouri," Nathan replied, his focus on the task at hand. "Before the war." "The war?" Florence asked. "You mean the war between the states?" Nathan nodded, his expression closing slightly. "Served with the Union. 15th Missouri Cavalry." Florence did some quick mental arithmetic. "You must have been very young." 17 when I enlisted." "Old enough," Nathan said shortly, making it clear the topic wasn't one he cared to elaborate on. The bell jangled, and Florence turned to greet her first customer of the day, Mrs. Peterson, the banker's wife, who immediately froze at the sight of Nathan. "Good morning, Mrs. Peterson," Florence said brightly. "What can I help you with today?" Mrs. Peterson's eyes darted between Florence and Nathan, curiosity evident. "Just some sugar and tea, Mrs. Whittaker. I see you have help today." "Mr. Aldridge has kindly offered his assistance with some of the heavier work," Florence explained, feeling a need to justify Nathan's presence. "How thoughtful," Mrs. Peterson murmured, though her tone suggested she found it more suspicious than thoughtful. "Especially given your upcoming changes." Florence stiffened. "News travels fast, as always." "Jeremiah spoke with my husband at length yesterday," Mrs. Peterson said, selecting her tea. "He's very pleased with the arrangement, says it's the proper solution for everyone concerned." Nathan, who had been pretending not to listen while stocking a high shelf, turned slightly at this. Florence caught a glimpse of his profile, jaw tight with what looked like controlled anger. "Yes, well, not everyone shares that view," Florence said more boldly than she normally would have. 4 pounds of sugar, was it? Mrs. Peterson accepted her purchases with pursed lips and left, undoubtedly eager to spread the news that Florence Whittaker had a strange man helping in her store just days before her wedding. "I've created gossip," Nathan observed once the door closed. "Ellsworth thrives on gossip," Florence sighed. "By noon, half the town will be speculating on your presence here. Does that bother you?" He sounded genuinely concerned. Florence considered the question. "Oddly, no. Jeremiah has already decided my future without my input. Let people talk." Nathan smiled at that, a warm smile that reached his eyes. "You've got more fight in you than you let on, Mrs. Whittaker." Before Florence could respond, the bell jangled again. This time, Jeremiah stood in the doorway, his expression darkening as he took in the scene. Nathan balanced on a stepladder shelving goods, James playing happily at his feet, and Florence behind the counter looking more animated than she had in months. "Florence," Jeremiah said tightly, "I see you've hired help without consulting me." Florence straightened her spine. "Mr. Aldridge is assisting me voluntarily, and as I don't recall being consulted about our supposed engagement, I didn't think I needed your permission." Jeremiah's nostrils flared at her uncharacteristic defiance. "A word in private, if you please." Florence lifted James into her arms. "Mr. Aldridge, would you mind watching the counter for a moment?" Nathan stepped down from the ladder, his eyes never leaving Jeremiah. "Happy to, madam." Florence led Jeremiah to the small office at the back of the store, closing the door behind them but leaving it slightly ajar so she could keep an eye on James. "Who is that man?" Jeremiah demanded without preamble. "And why is he working in my store?" "It's still my store until Sunday, according to your own timeline," Florence replied with more calm than she felt. "And Mr. Aldridge is a customer who kindly offered assistance with some tasks I've been struggling with." "Don't be naive, Florence. Men don't offer assistance without expecting something in return." Jeremiah's gaze was contemptuous. "I won't have my future wife creating scandal days before our wedding." Florence's temper, normally well-controlled, flared. "I haven't agreed to marry you, Jeremiah. You've simply announced it as fact. Don't be ridiculous. We both know you have no choice," Jeremiah snapped. "Unless you'd prefer to see your son raised in poverty, or perhaps an orphanage when you can't feed him." "Is that a threat?" Florence asked, her voice shaking. "It's reality," Jeremiah said coldly. "Now dismiss that cowboy and compose yourself. I've brought the paperwork for transferring ownership of the store. After the wedding, naturally." Florence stared at him, suddenly seeing with perfect clarity the future that awaited her as Jeremiah Whittaker's wife, a life of submission to a man who viewed her as property, who would use James as leverage whenever she displeased him. "I need time to think," she said finally. Jeremiah scoffed. "There's nothing to think about. Be practical, Florence. One more day," she insisted. "Surely you can grant me that much." Jeremiah studied her face, then nodded curtly. "Very well. One day to accept the inevitable. I'll return tomorrow for your answer, though we both know what it will be." He glanced toward the door. "And get rid of the cowboy. His kind brings nothing but trouble." When Florence returned to the main store, she found Nathan helping an elderly woman with her purchases, handling both the merchandise and the money with practiced ease. James sat on the counter, giggling as Nathan made faces at him between customers. "Everything all right?" Nathan asked quietly once the elderly woman had gone. "Jeremiah expects me to dismiss you," Florence said, taking over the counter. "And will you?" Florence looked up at him, at the steadiness in those green eyes. "I should, It would be the sensible thing to do. But, Nathan prompted with a slight smile, but I find I'm tired of being sensible if it means letting others dictate my life. She squared her shoulders. If you're still willing to help, I'd welcome it, at least for today. They worked together for the rest of the morning, falling into an easy rhythm as if they'd been partners for years rather than hours. Nathan proved to have a quick mind for business, suggesting small changes that immediately improved the store's layout and function. By midday, Florence was both impressed and curious. "You seem to know a great deal about running a mercantile for a cowboy," she observed during a quiet moment. Nathan shrugged. "Told you my family had a store. I grew up in it before the war changed everything." "What happened?" Florence asked gently. Nathan was silent for so long she thought he wouldn't answer. Finally, he said, "Raiders burned it during the war. My parents were inside." He spoke matter-of-factly, but Florence saw the old pain in his eyes. "After that, my siblings went to relatives in Illinois. I joined up, then kept riding west after the war ended. Nothing left for me back there." "I'm sorry," Florence said, understanding now his interest in her situation. He too had lost everything once. "It was a long time ago," Nathan said, then changed the subject. "What will you tell Jeremiah tomorrow?" Florence sighed. "I don't know. He's right that I have few options." "There are always options," Nathan said firmly. "Sometimes we just need help seeing them." The afternoon brought a steady stream of customers, many clearly there more to observe the mysterious cowboy helping the widow than to make purchases. Florence endured the speculative looks and whispered comments with as much dignity as she could muster. As closing time approached, Sheriff Miller appeared, his expression serious. "Florence," he greeted her, then nodded to Nathan. "And you must be Aldridge. Word about town is you're getting mighty friendly with our widow." "Sheriff," Nathan acknowledged calmly. "Just lending a hand where it's needed." The sheriff's eyes narrowed slightly. "Known Mrs. Whittaker long, have you?" "Not long," Nathan admitted, "but I recognize a person being backed into a corner." Sheriff Miller sighed. "Look, I sympathize with your situation, Florence. But Jeremiah's been making noise about filing complaints, trespassing, interference with his property, even corrupting the morals of a minor." "That's absurd," Florence exclaimed. "Mr. Aldridge has done nothing improper." "Doesn't matter. Jeremiah has influence and he's not afraid to use it." The sheriff looked genuinely regretful. "I'd hate to see this get ugly." "Is that a warning, Sheriff?" Nathan asked, his tone mild but his stance subtly shifting to something more alert. "Just stating facts," Sheriff Miller replied. "Jeremiah Whittaker isn't a man to cross lightly." After the sheriff left, Florence sank onto a stool, the weight of her situation pressing down on her anew. "You should go," she told Nathan. "I won't have you facing legal troubles on my account." "Those charges wouldn't stand up to scrutiny," Nathan said dismissively. "Jeremiah's bluffing." "Perhaps, but he can make life very difficult in the meantime." Florence rubbed her temples, feeling a headache building. "This is exactly why I have no choice but to accept his proposal. In this town, in this time, a woman alone has no power against a man of means." "Unless someone stands with her," Nathan said quietly. Florence looked up at him, struck by the determination in his face. "Why would you do that? You hardly know me." Nathan was silent for a moment, seeming to weigh his words. "I've spent 10 years drifting from place to place, never staying long enough to put down roots. But in all that time, I've never forgotten what it feels like to have choices taken away by those with more power." He met her gaze directly. "I can't give you back your husband or change the laws that favor men like Jeremiah, but I can stand beside you while you fight for your right to choose your own path." Florence felt something stir within her, a spark of hope she'd thought extinguished. "And how exactly do we fight?" "First, We need to know exactly where you stand legally, Nathan said, all business now. Is there a lawyer in town who isn't beholden to Jeremiah? Florence thought for a moment. Mr. Hayes, perhaps. He's new to Ellsworth, only arrived last year, and he seems to have principles. Then we talk to Mr. Hayes tonight, Nathan decided. Find out if there's any legal way to challenge Jeremiah's claim to the store. And if there isn't, Florence asked, voicing her deepest fear. Then we consider other options, Nathan said firmly, but we don't give up. That evening, after closing the store and settling James with Mrs. Holloway, Florence and Nathan made their way to the small office where Lawrence Hayes, attorney at law, was working late by lamplight. The lawyer, a slender man with spectacles and prematurely gray hair, seemed surprised by their visit but invited them in nonetheless. Mrs. Whittaker, I've heard about your situation, he said after introductions were made. Though I must say, the town's version differs somewhat from what you're telling me. Gossip rarely aligns with truth, Florence said wearily. Can you help us, Mr. Hayes? Is there any legal claim I might have to the store? The lawyer considered this, tapping his fingers thoughtfully on his desk. Without a deed or will naming you specifically, it's difficult. Kansas law does provide some protection for widows. You're entitled to a portion of your husband's estate, regardless of documentation. But if the store was purchased with Whittaker family money before your marriage, as you say, then Jeremiah's claim is strong. Florence's hope dimmed. So I have no recourse. I didn't say that, Mr. Hayes clarified. There might be another approach. Did your husband leave any documentation at all? Letters, business records, anything indicating his intention for you to inherit? Florence thought hard. There's his ledger. He kept meticulous records of the store's finances, including notes about future plans. That could be useful, Mr. Hayes said, his interest clearly piqued. And you've been running the store successfully since his death. Yes, though business has been slower without Thomas. Still, you've maintained the enterprise. That counts for something. The lawyer turned to Nathan. And your interest in this matter, Mr. Aldridge? Nathan met the lawyer's gaze squarely. I believe in justice, sir, and forcing a widow to marry against her will for financial security isn't just. Mr. Hayes studied him for a long moment, then nodded as if satisfied by what he saw. Bring me the ledger and any other documentation tomorrow morning. I can't promise anything, but there might be grounds for a challenge based on verbal contract and proven ability to manage the business. As they walked back toward the store, Florence felt a mixture of hope and trepidation. Do you think there's really a chance? She asked Nathan. There's always a chance, he replied, his shoulder occasionally brushing against hers in the gathering darkness. But we should prepare for all possibilities, including failure, Florence said softly. Nathan stopped walking and turned to face her. In the dim light from a nearby saloon, his expression was earnest. Florence, I want you to know something. Whatever happens with the legal challenge, you're not alone in this fight anymore. The sincerity in his voice warmed her in a way she hadn't experienced since Thomas died. Why me, Nathan? Of all the people with troubles you must have encountered in your travels, why stop for mine? Nathan was quiet for a moment, seeming to search for the right words. When I rode into Ellsworth, I wasn't planning to stay more than a night or two. Just another town along the trail. But then I saw you through the store window, standing so straight despite the weight on your shoulders. There was something about your determination that made me look twice. His voice softened. And then when I met you, when I saw how Jeremiah treated you, I couldn't just ride away. Florence felt her cheeks warm at his words. You make me sound braver than I am. You're raising a son alone in a world that doesn't make it easy for women to stand on their own, Nathan said simply. That takes courage. They had reached the side entrance to her apartment. Florence hesitated at the door, suddenly reluctant for the evening to end. "Thank you for everything today, for helping in the store, for taking me to Mr. Hayes. I'll be here tomorrow," Nathan promised. Early, before Jeremiah returns for his answer, Florence nodded, then impulsively reached out to squeeze his hand. "Good night, Nathan." His fingers tightened briefly around hers. "Good night, Florence." That night, Florence searched through Thomas's papers until she found the ledger Mr. Hayes had requested. As she leafed through it, she found more than financial records. There were notes about plans for expansion, ideas for new product lines, and even a section titled Florence's Dowry Investment. With trembling fingers, she read Thomas's careful documentation of the money her father had provided when they married, a modest sum that had been invested in the initial inventory. According to Thomas's records, that investment entitled Florence to a 20% share in the business from the beginning. It wasn't enough to claim full ownership, but it was something proof that she had a financial stake in the store beyond being Thomas's widow. With renewed determination, Florence continued searching, eventually finding letters between Thomas and Jeremiah discussing the business. In one, dated just a year before Thomas's death, her husband had clearly stated his intention that Florence should inherit his share of the store should anything happen to him. By the time Florence finally went to bed, the first light of dawn was creeping through her window. Despite her exhaustion, her heart felt lighter than it had in months. There was hope, slim, perhaps, but real. She had barely dressed herself in James when a knock came at her door. Nathan stood there, his hat in his hands and concern in his eyes. "Jeremiah's already at the store," he said without preamble, "and he's not alone. Brought 2 men with him, look like hired muscle." Florence's momentary optimism faltered. "He means to intimidate me." "Probably," Nathan agreed, "but we have something he doesn't expect." He nodded at the papers in her hand. "You found evidence." Florence quickly explained what she'd discovered overnight. Nathan's face brightened with each detail. "This changes everything," he said. "We need to get these to Hayes immediately." "But Jeremiah—" "Let me handle Jeremiah," Nathan said with quiet confidence. "You take these papers to Hayes and bring him back to the store. I'll make sure Jeremiah stays put until you return." Florence hesitated, concern for Nathan's safety warring with her need to secure legal help. "His men look dangerous." "I've faced worse," Nathan said with a slight smile. "Go, Florence, this may be our only chance." With James on her hip and the precious documents clutched to her chest, Florence slipped out the back way and hurried toward the lawyer's office, praying Nathan could hold Jeremiah at bay long enough for her to return with help. Mr. Hayes was just opening his office when Florence arrived, breathless from her hurried pace. The lawyer listened intently as she explained what she'd found, his expression growing more interested with each new piece of evidence. "This is significant," he said, examining Thomas's notations. "Not definitive, but certainly enough to establish a legal claim to at least part of the business. And this letter." He held up the correspondence between the brothers. "This clearly indicates Thomas's wishes regarding inheritance." "Is it enough to stop Jeremiah?" Florence asked anxiously. "Possibly," Mr. Hayes said cautiously. "At minimum, it's enough to delay any forced marriage while the courts consider your claim. Jeremiah can't legally coerce you into marriage by threatening property that might legitimately be yours." Relief washed over Florence. "Then we need to show him these papers immediately. He's at the store now." The lawyer gathered the documents and his briefcase. "Lead the way, Mrs. Whittaker. This should be a most interesting conversation." When they reached the mercantile, Florence was startled to find the main street crowded with townspeople, many congregating near her store. As she approached, she could hear raised voices from inside. Pushing through the onlookers with James clutched protectively against her, Florence entered to find Nathan standing calmly behind the counter, while Jeremiah and his two companions faced him across it. Sheriff Miller stood to one side, looking distinctly uncomfortable. "There she is," Jeremiah said as Florence entered. "Florence, tell this cowboy that he has no right to be in my store." "It's not your store yet, Jeremiah," Florence replied, her voice steadier than she expected. "And Mr. Aldridge has my permission to be here." Jeremiah's face reddened. "This is ridiculous. Sheriff, I want this man removed for trespassing." "Actually," Mr. Hayes interjected, stepping forward with his briefcase, "I believe we need to discuss the matter of ownership before anyone is removed from the premises." "Who are you?" Jeremiah demanded. "Lawrence Hayes, attorney at law," the lawyer replied smoothly. "I represent Mrs. Whittaker in this matter." Jeremiah's expression shifted from anger to wary calculation. "There's nothing to represent. The store belongs to the Whittaker family. Florence has no claim except as my wife." "That's not entirely accurate," Mr. Hayes said, laying out the documents on the counter. "According to your brother's own records, Mrs. Whittaker has a 20% ownership share from the beginning due to her dowry investment. Furthermore, we have written evidence of Thomas Whittaker's intention for his wife to inherit his portion of the business." Jeremiah stared at the papers, momentarily speechless. The sheriff moved closer, examining the documents with interest. "These look legitimate to me," Sheriff Miller commented. "Thomas always was meticulous with his bookkeeping." "This changes nothing," Jeremiah insisted, though with less conviction. 20% isn't controlling interest." "No," Mr. Hayes agreed. "But combined with her late husband's share, which he clearly intended her to inherit, it would give her majority ownership. And even with just 20%, she can't be forced out without compensation." The murmuring of the crowd that had followed them inside grew louder. Florence noticed Mrs. Peterson and other prominent townswomen among them, watching the proceedings with undisguised interest. "This is absurd," Jeremiah sputtered. "A woman can't run a business of this size. It's not proper." "She's been running it for 6 months," Nathan pointed out quietly, "while raising a child alone. And who are you to involve yourself in family matters?" Jeremiah rounded on him. "Some drifter with no stake in this town or its people." Nathan's expression remained calm, but Florence saw his hands tense slightly at his sides. "I'm someone who believes a woman deserves the right to choose her own path." "Mrs. Whittaker," Sheriff Miller said, turning to her, "what is it you want from all this?" The room fell silent, all eyes on Florence. She looked down at James, then at the store her husband had built, then finally at Nathan, whose steady gaze gave her strength. "I want what's rightfully mine," she said clearly. "The chance to run this store as Thomas intended, to support myself and my son through honest work. I don't want to be forced into a marriage without love or respect simply because society says a woman needs a husband to have value." A murmur of approval ran through the female onlookers. Even some of the men nodded thoughtfully. "Jeremiah," Florence continued, facing her brother-in-law directly, "I'm not trying to take what isn't mine. If you can prove the store truly belongs solely to you, I'll accept that. But I won't be bullied into marriage as the price of keeping a roof over my son's head." Jeremiah looked around at the gathered townspeople, clearly gauging the shift in public opinion. His jaw worked as he considered his options. "This will mean court," he said finally. "Lawyers, expenses, public airing of family matters. If necessary," Florence agreed. "Though I'd prefer to reach an agreement that respects both our interests." Mr. Hayes cleared his throat. "Perhaps a partnership arrangement could be considered, Mrs. Whittaker maintains operational control of the Ellsworth store, while Mr. Whittaker receives a percentage of profits in recognition of the family's initial investment. Jeremiah scoffed. A partnership with a woman. Preposterous. Times are changing, Mr. Whittaker, the lawyer observed mildly. Women across the country are increasingly taking active roles in business. Kansas itself has been at the forefront of expanding women's legal rights. It's a fair offer, Sheriff Miller added. Better than a drawn-out court battle that might not go your way. Florence could see Jeremiah calculating, weighing the cost and public embarrassment of a legal fight against the compromise being offered. 30% of profits, he countered, and I want quarterly reviews of the books. 25%, Florence responded firmly, with annual reviews conducted by a neutral third party. Jeremiah's eyebrows rose at her businesslike approach. After a moment's consideration, he nodded reluctantly. Very well. Hayes can draw up the papers. He shot a venomous look at Nathan. But I want it understood that no drifter has any claim or say in Whittaker business. Mr. Aldridge has been instrumental in helping me stand up for my rights, Florence said, her chin lifting. But he has made no claim on the business. With that matter seemingly settled, the crowd began to disperse, many stopping to offer Florence words of support or congratulations. Sheriff Miller escorted Jeremiah and his men outside, while Mr. Hayes promised to have partnership agreements ready the following day. Finally, only Florence, James, and Nathan remained in the store. You did it, Nathan said softly, pride evident in his voice. We did it, Florence corrected, bouncing James gently as he began to fuss. I couldn't have faced him without your support. Nathan shrugged modestly. You had the courage all along. You just needed someone to remind you of it. He hesitated, suddenly looking uncertain. Now that your situation with Jeremiah is resolved. Florence felt a sudden tightness in her chest. You'll be moving on, I suppose, now that your good deed is done. Actually, Nathan said, meeting her eyes, I was wondering if Ellsworth might need another business. A saddle and leather goods shop, perhaps. Been thinking it might be time to put down roots. Hope fluttered in Florence's heart. Ellsworth is growing, such a shop might do well here. And Nathan took a step closer. I was hoping I might call on you properly, not as a damsel in distress, but as a woman I've come to admire greatly. Florence felt warmth spread through her. I think I'd like that very much, Mr. Aldridge. A slow smile spread across Nathan's face. Good. Because it seems I've found something worth staying for. The weeks that followed brought significant changes to Florence's life. With Jeremiah back in Topeka and the partnership agreement legally formalized, she threw herself into improving the store. Nathan helped whenever he could, while also securing a small space 2 doors down for his leather goods shop. Their courtship progressed with proper decorum, though everyone in town knew the unusual circumstances of their meeting. Florence found herself looking forward to Nathan's daily visits, to the quiet conversations after James was asleep, to the way his green eyes crinkled when he smiled at something she said. By midsummer, Nathan's business was flourishing, his skill with leather drawing customers from surrounding communities. Florence's store was prospering too, especially after she implemented some of Nathan's suggestions for inventory management and display. On a warm August evening, Nathan invited Florence for a ride outside town, Mrs. Holloway happily agreeing to watch James. They rode to a small creek lined with cottonwood trees, where Nathan had prepared a simple picnic. As they sat side by side watching the sunset paint the Kansas sky in brilliant oranges and pinks, Nathan took Florence's hand. I've been thinking, he said, his usual confidence giving way to endearing nervousness, about the future, about what I want. Florence's heart quickened. And what is that? "A home," Nathan said simply. "Not just a place to hang my hat, but a real home. With you and James, if you'll have me." Florence studied his face, the strong features now so dear to her. "Are you proposing marriage, Mr. Aldridge?" "I am," he confirmed with a smile. "Though I want to be clear, this isn't about saving you or protecting you. You've proven you can stand on your own. This is about choosing each other, freely and with full hearts." Tears welled in Florence's eyes. "When Thomas died, I thought I'd never find love again. I was prepared to settle for security, for whatever arrangement would keep James safe." She squeezed his hand. "I never expected to meet a man who would fight for my right to choose my own path, who would see me as a partner rather than a possession. Is that a yes?" Nathan asked, his eyes shining with hope. Florence leaned forward and kissed him softly. "It's a definite yes." They married in September with much of the town in attendance. Even Jeremiah sent a grudging gift, though he didn't attend personally. The ceremony was simple but joyful, with James toddling down the aisle ahead of his mother, clutching the wooden horse that had been his first gift from Nathan. After the wedding, Florence and Nathan combined their businesses, expanding the mercantile to include a dedicated leather goods section. Their partnership in business proved as harmonious as their marriage, each bringing different strengths to their shared enterprise. The following spring brought the birth of their first child together, a son they named Thomas Nathan Aldridge, honoring both Florence's first husband and the man who had given her the courage to forge her own destiny. As she watched Nathan cradling their newborn while James leaned against his knee, Florence reflected on the strange twists of fate that had brought them together. "Happy?" Nathan asked, looking up to find her watching them. "More than I ever thought possible," Florence replied honestly. "When Jeremiah tried to force me into marriage, I thought my choices were gone. I never imagined his ultimatum would lead me to real love." "Sometimes the darkest moments lead us to the brightest futures," Nathan said, reaching for her hand. "I'm just grateful I rode into Ellsworth when I did." "As am I," Florence agreed, joining her family on the sofa. "As am I." Years passed, and the Aldridge family prospered alongside the growing town of Ellsworth. Florence and Nathan welcomed two more children, a daughter, Elizabeth, and another son, William, while James grew into a fine young man who eventually took over management of the store's day-to-day operations. Nathan never returned to the drifting life of a cowboy, finding in Florence and their children the home and purpose he had sought since losing his family in the war. And Florence, who had once faced a future defined by another man's demands, lived the life she chose as a businesswoman, a mother, and a wife who had married for love rather than necessity. On their 20th wedding anniversary, as they sat on the porch of the fine house their business success had built, Nathan took Florence's hand, still slender but now marked with the gentle signs of years spent in work and motherhood. "Do you ever wonder," he asked, "what might have happened if I hadn't stopped in Ellsworth that spring?" Florence considered the question. "Sometimes. But then I remember what you told me that day in the store, that there are always options, if we're brave enough to see them." "You were always braver than you knew," Nathan said, his thumb caressing the wedding band he had placed on her finger 2 decades earlier. "I just reminded you of your strength." "And you gave me the greatest gift of all," Florence replied, leaning against his shoulder. "The right to choose my own path, to marry for love rather than necessity." As the Kansas sunset painted the sky in familiar shades of gold and crimson, Florence Whittaker Aldridge counted her blessings: a thriving business, children growing strong and independent, and beside her, the cowboy who had stepped into her life at the darkest hour and said she deserved to choose for herself. It had not been an easy road. There had been struggles, setbacks, and the ordinary challenges that face any family. But through it all, Florence had never forgotten the lesson of that pivotal spring, that even in a world that often denied women agency, a single act of courage could change the course of a life. And as Nathan drew her close in the gathering twilight, Florence knew with absolute certainty that she had chosen well.